Start a new series. We're just doing 2 weeks back to back. And just to start, let me just ask you this question. I want you to think about it for a second. Do you really think about heaven much? Like, do you think about it a lot? Because, what's interesting is, I'm a pastor, and I realize, a lot of times I don't think about heaven that much. I think a lot of us spend very little time, actually, thinking about the afterlife. But it's kind of weird when you think about it because, if you're a believer, it's kind of like the whole thing, right? We literally read these Bible verses that say, your life is but a breath. It's like a vapor. And the whole idea is, God says, the whole reason why he can demand, substantial sacrifice in this life is because he's but this life is going to be like that, and then you're going to be in eternity forever. So this life is just this tiny little blip in comparison. And it's interesting because we say we believe that, but we don't really spend our energies that way. We seem very, very focused on here and now. Right? In fact, most messages that I teach, to be honest with you, to you, are all about how you can live your life here and now. They're not as much focused on eternity. There's implications, of course, but I think we don't really talk about heaven a lot in the church. And that's interesting. I think the church is actually the problem. It's people like me. I'm the problem, okay? Not you guys. You guys are off the hook. Especially in our American church. I think in other places around the world where the world is really, really hard to live in, where life is very difficult and scary, there's a lot of talk about the fact that God has something prepared for you after this. But in our American church, kind of in our comfortable Western culture, to be honest with you, life is usually pretty good. The stuff that we're dealing with is usually pretty decent. So a lot of conversation about don't worry, God has something great for you beyond this. A lot of times I think the American church is well, I'm enjoying this right now. I'm having a great time right now, right? And there's kind of this tendency to almost make our heaven right now, to do the live your best life right here, right now. Interestingly enough too, it kind of shocks me when I talk to people who have no faith. They say they're an atheist and agnostic. They don't really know what they believe. And I'll talk to them about the idea of the afterlife. And they're I'm not really sure. It always startles me that they're so comfortable not knowing. Anyone else? When you talk to them, they're I just don't know. And I'm so are you spending a lot of the time trying to figure this out? And they're no, not really. And you're well, you better get on it, man, right? I don't know if you know this, right? But none of us are getting out of this thing alive. You get that, right? Have you ever seen a movie where they're we're not going to make it out alive, right? That's all of us in this life. You get that, right? No one's making it out of this alive. We're all going to die. And we better prep for that because it's 100%. You're definitely going to die. And it's so you don't really know? No. But you're not really concerned? No. And you're I'm startled by the fact that you're not concerned right now, right? You're not concerned at all? You just jump in your car and fly down the freeway with people going past you at 60 miles an hour, and you're just totally fine with that, not knowing what happens if they cross the center line? It just sounds terrifying to me. Bro, you're going to rewire your house and not know what happens? You're working on active circuits, not knowing what happens if your heart stops? Terrifying, right? Troubling deeply to me. But it's interesting because so many people, we kind of put off this thought about death and the afterlife. We don't even think about it. I don't really want to think about that. Don't really want to talk about that. In fact, I think, to be honest with you, a lot of people, they don't really think about the afterlife much until they lose somebody who they really love. That's usually what in our Western culture, I think, really shifts us where we actually start to think about eternity. We lose somebody who we care about deeply and they're no longer with us. And then we start to ask the question so what happens after this? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not really any different than any of you. A similar situation happened to me a handful of years ago. I've been a pastor for a number of years. It wasn't anything like that, but I believed in heaven, but then somebody who we loved a lot, somebody who I got to walk through them going through the Alpha course and walk through them becoming my friend and walk through them literally becoming a worship leader on our teams. Just a young woman, young child. One day I got this phone call late at night. Hey, she was involved in an accident, and the next morning I woke up to a message that just said she's gone. And a drunk driver crossed the center line and killed this young woman who was a worship leader at our church. And I remember that it messed me up a little bit. Not in regards to trusting God, but the picture of heaven became really clear because I had a hard time picturing where she was. Because I loved her so much that it was really hard to think about her being gone. So I had the struggle of but where is she? And, God timing in regards to how all this works. At the exact same time, my sister had previously been at a church in Austin, Texas when she lived in Texas. And the pastor there was this guy named John Burke. And he's a really legit pastor, been a good pastor for years and years and years. He actually wrote this book at the exact same time. It had just come out that was called Imagine Heaven. And some of you guys I've given you this book. It's pretty interesting. But he wrote this book because he got fascinated with the topic of heaven, specifically talking to people who had had near-death experiences and hearing these strange glimpses that they got of the afterlife. And he just basically compiled all this information because it started adding up so much. In fact, this is pretty weird. I didn't know this. Near-death experiences have been around for a long time, but they've actually become so much more common because of our life-saving technology that there have been articles written in these medical journals about these experiences. Literally, Psychiatry, The Lancet, Critical Care Quarterly, American Journal of Psychiatry, and the Journal of American Medical Association all have had articles written about people's experiences when they died. Dr. Jeffrey Long, who's a radiation oncologist, he was fascinated with this as well. He actually interviewed over 1,000 people, talking to them about what they had experienced in moments where they had died and then come back to life. And he said this, and this is fascinating. He said, "By studying thousands of detailed accounts of near-death experiences, I found the evidence that led to this astounding conclusion. Near-death experiences provide such powerful scientific evidence that it's reasonable to accept the existence of an afterlife." Isn't that wild? Just as a scientist, he's I've talked to enough people and I've registered enough of their experiences that he said, it would not be unreasonable for you to say it appears as though there's something real that happens after we die. Burke, who wrote this book, he started writing it because as he talked to people about these experiences, he said the clarity, the consistency, the similarity between people's stories is astounding. Even if they have completely different backgrounds, they come from different cultures, they come from different races, they keep talking about this same place. This book is fascinating, and if you want to, you can search it on Amazon. I think it's worth a read. If you've lost somebody who you love, this book helped me tremendously to picture the place where my friend Carrie went. Now, some people would say in this moment when you talk about this, near-death experiences and the concept of heaven, they'll say, well, that doesn't seem, biblical. That doesn't seem right, Cameron. In fact, there's plenty of people, if you just Google that online, there'll be plenty of fundamental people who will talk all about how that's evil. I'm leading you all astray. You're probably all going to hell because I'm talking about this today. But what's fascinating about that is they'll say, well, it's not biblical, but at the same time I go, I'm not so sure. Because in fact, there were two different people in the Bible, in the New Testament, who got a glimpse of heaven before they died. Two different people got a glimpse of heaven and talked about it in the New Testament. And in fact, here's what's really weird when you think about this. Both of these men had near-death experiences. Now, maybe that's just coincidence, but maybe not. The first was Paul. Paul actually said in 2 Corinthians 12, 2-4, "I was caught up to the third heaven." Third heaven would be actually where God's at. First heaven, sky. Second heaven, outer space. Third heaven, that would be the place they called where God resided. 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things that no human is allowed to tell. He says, I got to see heaven before I died. Now, what's fascinating about this, he says, I had this experience 14 years ago. If you travel back 14 years before that, at a similar time frame, this story happened. Acts 14, 19 through 20. It says, some Jews arrived from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowds to their side. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of town, thinking that he was dead. But as the believers gathered around him, he got up and went back into town. Pretty strange that the time frame is similar, that he actually basically was left for dead and he saw heaven. There's another person in the New Testament who saw a glimpse of heaven. His name was John. John saw a glimpse of heaven, and he specifically says it happened when he was exiled to Patmos. He was actually tortured, and then he was shipped off to this tiny little island, and the goal was for him to die from starvation and the elements. And he says that on a Sunday morning, he's there and he's praising God, and all of a sudden something supernatural happens in regards to him seeing God. Now, this could just be a supernatural revelation, but also it is interesting that it happens when he's basically starving to death on an island. Perhaps this is some sort of near-death experience as well. He actually says this in Revelation 4, 1 through 3. Then as I looked, I saw a door standing open in heaven, and the same voice I had heard before spoke to me like a trumpet blast. The voice said, come up here and I will show you what must happen after this. And instantly I was in the Spirit, and I saw a throne in heaven and someone sitting on it. The one sitting on the throne was as brilliant as gemstones, like jasper and carnelian, and the glow of an emerald circled his throne like a rainbow. Both give this picture of the fact that there's this real place waiting for us. They say that it's like exceedingly beautiful, exceedingly amazing. And what's fascinating is Burke interviewed thousands of people. He found something similar. Now, here's what I would say, okay? These stories on their own don't really matter. Okay, because people can have crazy experiences, people can have weird experiences, and a lot of coincidences can exist, okay? So what I don't mean is that just by hearing someone's story about seeing something in an afterlife, you should believe. But here's where it does get fascinating, is that when you take some of these stories and you lay them up against the Bible, they are strikingly similar. And that's where I think all of a sudden maybe they become valuable. Because what they're saying lines up shockingly close to what we see in God's word. There are a few glimpses we get of heaven. And my goal is for you to get a glimpse of them today, to recognize what might actually exist beyond, because I think a lot of us don't really get it, or maybe we haven't really taken time to think about it. When Burke interviewed people, one of the people he interviewed was Captain Dale Black. He was a commercial pilot. He was flying a small Piper Navajo out of Los Angeles, and on takeoff he had engine failure and collided with an aviation monument that was there at the airport. There was 3 men in the craft. 2 men died instantly. Dale died, but then was revived by the paramedics when they came to get him. And afterward, Dale said this about these moments. He says, I was fast approaching a magnificent city, golden and gleaming among a myriad of resplendent colors. The entire city was bathed in light, an opaque whiteness in which the light was intense but diffused. In that dazzling light, every color imaginable seemed to exist, and what's the right word? Played. The colors seemed to almost be alive, dancing in the air. Below me lay the purest, most perfect grass, precisely the right length, and not a blade was bent or even out of place. My eyes were next drawn to a river that stretched from the gathering area in the middle of the city to the wall. The river was perfectly clear with bluish-white hue, and the light didn't shine on the water, but mysteriously shone within it somehow. This is a beautiful picture he has. He says while he was out that he saw this beautiful place. But it's surprising because if some of you haven't really spent much time reading the Bible, you're like, well, that doesn't sound like heaven to me. Because the heaven that we see in movies and stuff like that, right? It's clouds and harps, right? It's in the sky. It's clouds. It's ethereal. It's all this stuff. But you're like, wait a second. He's talking about being on earth with grass under his feet and a beautiful city and all of this. That seems different. But it isn't surprising at all if you know your Bible. It isn't surprising at all if you've actually read and looked into what John says this eternal position looks like. He says this in Revelation 21, 1 through 3. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, "Look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them." In this moment where he gets to see a glimpse of heaven, he doesn't talk about us being up in the clouds with God. He actually says God has remade the earth, that he's ended the old earth and remade the earth. And now there's this amazing city that God has been crafting in eternity that's now coming down to this newly formed earth where now God will reside with us here. In fact, the pictures he gives are of fruit trees, rivers, beautiful fields. The idea that heaven is this ethereal place in the clouds is not actually correct. In fact, if I may, the picture that many of us have of heaven, of being up in the clouds, right, with God, that's the waiting place until we actually get to where our eternal location will be. God says that after all of this age ends, after all of us die, we might all go to this place of waiting, but then he's going to come and he's going to destroy and recreate this earth. And what we're going to do is then come with God back to this earth to live with him in eternity. What I actually think about it is it's almost like, get this, it's almost like circling all the way back around to the Garden of Eden. To a perfect earth not marred by sin, and God not existing out there with us down here, but God residing with us in this perfect earth. And I don't know about you, but when I got that picture, honestly, it was relieving to me. Because when I thought about Carrie, and I thought about her being like just some spirit somewhere, like floating off in the clouds, that didn't give me comfort at all. Or honestly, myself, when I think about the afterlife and you're like, there's eternity waiting for you and you're going to be with God forever, and you're like, what, just like sitting on a cloud somewhere? It didn't really like do it for me. But then someone's like, well, no, you understand, right, that we're actually coming back to this earth, that we're going to live in a tangible planet here with God, and that we'll actually be with God in this earth, just no longer marred by sin. And I was like, that makes sense. That connects with what I would understand of actually being with God in this place. It's interesting too, because Dale, he actually talks about seeing this city. Really interesting. He says, I saw this giant city. And that's what John sees as well. When he talks about this city of Jerusalem coming out of heaven, he explains it this way. I'm going to read you Revelation 21, 15 through 18, and then 21 through 23 as he describes this city. He says, the angel who talked to me held in his hand a gold measuring stick to measure the city, its gates, and its wall. When he measured it, he found that it was square, as wide as it was long. In fact, the length and the width and the height were each 1,400 miles. And then he measured the walls and found them to be 216 feet thick, according to the human standard used by the angel. The wall was made of jasper, and the city was pure gold, as clear as glass. There's kind of a mixed metaphor there, gold being the value, glass being kind of the image. You could see through it, something spiritual kind of made by God. It says in verse 21, the 12 gates were made of pearls, each gate from a single pearl, and the main street was pure gold as clear as glass. I saw no temple in the city, which that's interesting because you would think there would be, right? For the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb, that's Jesus, just a symbol for Jesus, are its temple. And the city has no need of sun or of moon, for the glory of God illuminates the city, and the Lamb is its light. Wow. He says there is this giant city that comes down from heaven. The place where God resides, where we would reside with him. It's made of gold and precious stones. And it's fascinating because it says that its length and its width are 1,400 miles, which means that inside of this city is 2 million square feet. Now, just for reference, the contiguous United States is 3 million square feet. Let me show you how big this city is in a picture real quick. Can you throw it up on the side screens for me? You can leave it up for a second. This is how big this city is. Right, yes, correct. Whoa, thank you. Whoever actually got what I'm trying to show you. It's 1,400 miles by 1,400 miles. This isn't some little city. It's a walled nation. It is giant. Inside of this city is room for mountain ranges. Inside this city is room for rivers and giant lakes that appear like oceans, all inside of this city that God dwells. It's as big as a country. But then what's really fascinating about it is this city defies logic. It is a marvel created by God because, get this, it's not just that it's 1,400 miles wide by 1,400 meters, or excuse me, not meters, we're not in Europe. What am I talking? Feet. 1,400 miles wide and long. It says this, that its dimensions are all the same, that it is 1,400 miles tall as well. That this is a giant perfect cube that sits on earth. Now here's why this gets crazy, okay? Because that's a lot of space. But if it's 1,400 miles tall, many people have then said, well, at 1,400 miles tall, there could be multiple levels inside of this city. Multiple, right? Not only that, but like literally, the highest mountain we have on earth is 6 miles tall. That's it. Did you know that? That's not that high, right? And this says it's 1,400 miles tall, which, get this, if every single level on this city had a Mount Everest in it, there would still be 233 floors. What? But obviously, not every level would need to have a Mount Everest on it. There could be levels that are smaller, levels that are bigger. And I was thinking about this. If we just averaged between this, okay, if we just average what the levels might be, let's just say each level averages out to being 1 mile, which for reference, that's like what you see when you go out and you look at the sky. Like you would think you're still outside if you had a roof that was 1 mile above you. If that was the case, then inside of this building, okay, there would be enough land at 1 mile for each level that it would be the landmass of the entire earth 48 times over. Inside of this one city, there would be the same landmass as 48 earths. All of a sudden, the picture of all of us sharing this city doesn't seem like we're going to be crowded next to each other anymore, does it? Like we're going to be like stuck in a little cul-de-sac with our neighbor right next to us complaining about how we mow the line between our properties. All of a sudden you're like, wait, there's just in this city enough landmass for 48 earths. I'm pretty sure every one of us are going to go there and God's like, here's your land. Like, here's your expansive, do you like ranching? Anybody like what's that really famous ranching show right now? Yeah, anyone like, yeah, you're like, you get your own. You go there, he's like, there it is, man. There's like 1,000 cattle on your land. Awesome. Just waiting for us. It shocks me because when I see something like this, I realize, listen, what God has planned for eternity is way beyond something we can comprehend. Like just seeing something like that, you're like, whoa, okay, God has a way bigger, more awesome plan than I have. Like I thought we were just going to hang out in clouds and God's like, no. We're going to remake this earth and I'm going to remake a city, which means that we have far more expansive area than ever before. You see, the picture we get of the afterlife is a location way more beautiful than we could imagine. But what I think is also awesome with that is that's cool. But what we also see with these experiences and within the Bible is that when we go there, we actually are embodied once again. Dr. Richard Eby, he was actually in Chicago helping his friends move. He was throwing boxes off of a railing outside of their building. The railing broke and he fell 2 stories down to the concrete floor. When they came, he was dead. They literally hauled him to the hospital in a body bag and then he revived at the hospital. Insane. He was dead. They transported all the way there and then he came back to life. Crazy, okay? And he said that when he was there, he explained the same kind of location he saw, but what really stood out to him was his own body. He said this as he looked at himself. He said, I was the same size, the same shape as the person that I had seen in the mirror for years. I was clothed in a translucent flowing gown, pure white, but transparent to my gaze. And in amazement, I could see through my body and note the gorgeous white flowers behind and beneath me. This seemed perfectly normal, though thrillingly novel. My abdomen and chest were organless and transparent to my gaze, though translucent to my peripheral vision. Again, my mind here in heaven worked with electric-like speed, answering my unspoken query, they're not needed. Jesus is the life here. He's the needed energy. Many people who experience these near-death experiences talk about how they're embodied. They're not some sort of out-of-body experience, out of this body, but then present in a body. In fact, many people will comment that all of a sudden they recognize that pain they've struggled with their entire life is gone, that the age that they felt in their body has disappeared. Other people have even commented that during these near-death experiences, their struggle wasn't physical issues, but they've had mental issues their entire life. And the moment that they come to, they feel a clarity in their mind and a healing inside of their mind, that the depression or the sickness is gone, and all of a sudden their mind works with lightning-like clarity. Now, this is right on with what's said in the Bible. Paul, when he was talking to the first church, as people were dying and they wondering what's going to happen to these people, he says this in 2 Corinthians 5, 1-4. For we know that when this earthly tent we live in is taken down, that is when we die and we leave this earthly body, we will have a house in heaven, an eternal body made for us by God himself and not by human hands. We grow weary in our present bodies and we long to put on our heavenly bodies like new clothing, for we will put on heavenly bodies. We will not be spirits without bodies. While we live in these earthly bodies, we groan and we sigh, but it's not that we want to die to get rid of these bodies that clothe us. Rather, we want to put on our new bodies so that these dying bodies will be swallowed up by life. There is a new body prepared for you. And I need you to get this. This is really different. This is, again, where I say, like, Christianity is not just another normal world religion. Because almost everybody talks about the idea of exiting this body and going to a spiritual place. Christianity is really, really unique in regards to the fact that we actually believe that both your spirit and your body are part of who you are. So much so that when you leave this body, you don't just stay as a spirit. God gives you a new body because you need a body. In our faith, you need a body. You're meant to reside inside of something. And he says the same thing will be true when you get to heaven. And in fact, I think we got to see a little tiny glimpse of this when Jesus resurrected. When Jesus resurrected, he was fully embodied and people saw him. But at the same time, it was interesting because, like, he's walking with the guys from Emmaus. He breaks bread and they're like, it's Jesus. And he just goes poof and disappears. They're like, what the heck was that, right? They're sitting around eating behind locked doors and all of a sudden, poof, Jesus appears and he's like, peace, right? Amazing. Jesus seems to have exited who he was just 3 days earlier, where he was completely embodied and he was very, very static in regards to the fact that you could just follow Jesus from place to place. And all of a sudden now, he almost seems as though he's present, but he's untethered from just the constrictions that we live inside of. And I think we get this picture of the fact that when we get these new bodies, it's not just that we'll have bodies like we have that are healed, but bodies that are far and beyond what we can imagine. In fact, probably not many of you have read this book, but there's a book called The Elegant Universe by Brian Greene. He actually won awards for this book. And in it, he talks about string theory and, like, the whole idea of how this world works together. String theory, general relativity. In general, like, just let's be honest, it doesn't make any sense. When you read it, you're like, my brain too small to understand this, okay? When I read sections of it. But get this, though. Here's what he came to, just as a scientist. He said that in his opinion of understanding this, the world only reconciles general relativity, string theory, quantum mechanics. It only reconciles and functions if there are 6 more hidden dimensions that we don't know about. He said, like, it doesn't work unless our 3-dimensional world we think we live in actually has another hidden 6 that we just don't know about yet. And is it possible that when we get into eternity, we are bodies now that are fully able to access perhaps 9 different dimensions that we have no concept of yet? Another writer said, it would be like going to a painting on the wall and trying to explain to the painting what living in our life looks like. The painting couldn't possibly grasp what it would be like to live in present breathing life, to live in 3 dimensions instead of just a flat form. And he said, perhaps this is what it's going to be like when we move into our bodies. Friends, when we die, we will be embodied. And again, this completely gave me comfort when I thought of Carrie. She's not floating somewhere as a spirit, as an orb lost about. God's already prepared a body for her, and he's placed her inside that. For me too, I think, yeah, that makes sense for me, where it brings me so much comfort, because like the idea of being some sort of floating spirit out there, I can't get behind, I can't grasp. But you give me hands and feet, I can know what to do with this, right? That makes sense to me. I'm telling you, God has given this picture to us that in the afterlife, we will be embodied in a better body than we could ever imagine. So today, just to kind of start this conversation, and we'll finish it next week, do you really believe in heaven? Do you really believe this is what's waiting for you? Because here's my contention. I think very, very often, we as Christians really don't. And here's why I say that. I think for many people who even will say they're a Christian, who even will say that they're a God-fearing person, a God-believing person, if you told them that today was their day to exit this life and go to eternity, they would feel sad. They would feel a pang of sadness. And they would say, I don't know that I'm really ready to go yet. And listen, I'm not denigrating the feelings you have. But if we have that sense where we think like, I don't want to leave this life behind, it's just so good. It's so enjoyable. I need you to get maybe the reality is it's because you have far too low of a view of heaven. You haven't grasped yet how beautiful this place is that God has for you. You haven't grasped yet how amazing it's going to be to go. And maybe you need to expand your reality. I get it. Listen, there are days and there are moments I have right now, 4 beautiful little children. This last week, perfect sunny day, taking a walk after dinner with my wife, and I think, how could it get any better than this? Right? Like, how could it ever get any better than this? It's perfect. But what if this life was just a shadow? Not taking anything away from the beauty of this life, but what if it was just a shadow? In fact, there's this amazing verse in Hebrews 8:5 where it talks about what we do on earth, like as Jesus followers and as people who would worship God. And it says this in Hebrews 8:5, they, the priests, they serve in a system of worship that's only a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. When Moses was getting ready to build the tabernacle, God gave him this warning, be sure that you make everything according to the pattern I've shown you here in the mountain. He says that when worship of God started on this earth, God gave him the pattern. He said, I need you to do it like this because this is how it's done in heaven. But he said, don't get it twisted. He says, as amazing as it might be, all of this is just a shadow. The great philosopher Plato said this one time about our limited understanding. He said, imagine a group of men chained in a cave facing the inside wall. And he said, as they were chained in this cave with their heads only facing this inside wall, they would believe that this was the fullness of the universe. It's all they've ever experienced. It's all they've ever seen. And he says, in fact, they would believe that the voices they hear were coming from the shadows of men they saw on the wall. All of their experience of beauty and grandeur would simply be just the light that would bounce through this cave and land on the wall in front of them, the light of a fire, or the light of lightning, or the morning sun. And the sounds that they would hear would simply be just what they would picture are coming from this wall. But he said, but then if you could unchain these men and turn them around, they would realize that this entire time all they've been looking at is just a shadow. That an entire world exists outside of this, and simply by the fact that they hadn't grasped it yet, they couldn't understand how much beauty was behind them. And I agree. There's times, like I said, I have moments in this life where I just think, how could it get better than this? But when I look at heaven, and when I look at what God is having, I'm thinking, What if, as good as this is, friends, what if this is just a shadow? What if, like, the best moments we share, the most amazing beauty we see, what if all we're looking at is just shadows? And someday, this moment that so many of us think are so scary, when we take our last breath, all of a sudden it's like God turns us around and we realize, whoa. Man, I was thinking that was beautiful. I was thinking that was amazing, and you had something so much better prepared for me this entire time. Listen, God's word and even the evidence, I believe, points to an afterlife more awesome than we can imagine. And this is really, really good news. Really, really good news. If you're a Jesus follower, listen to me, when you read about heaven, it makes you love God even more, because I don't know about you, like I said, I look at this world and I'm like, God, you're so good, you blessed me so much. And I just think my Father in heaven's like, oh man, you don't even know. I have something so much more beautiful and so much more awesome than this plan for you. And we realize, wow, he deserves so much love. But for some of you who are Jesus followers, listen, today when I said the thought of leaving this life makes you sad, if that's the feeling that you had in your heart, I'm not picking on you. I'm not saying you don't trust Jesus, but I am saying this. I think it's because you have too low of a view of heaven. Maybe you need to read a book like this. Maybe you need to read through the stories and the pictures of heaven, and maybe you need to expand your thinking to realize, man, what if this is just a shadow and there's something so much more beautiful? If you're an unbeliever, that person's like, I don't really think about it, right? Again, terrifies me, but what if there really is an afterlife? Sometimes I talk to people who are like, I just don't believe, and I'm like, but don't you wish it was true? I mean, don't you wish, like, even if you don't believe yet, wouldn't you wish, like, there was a beautiful place where your consciousness went to, where it doesn't have to end? And I'm telling you that, friends, when we look at this, the evidence in God's word, there's enough to trust. Maybe there really is something waiting for us. I need you to get this. If you're still an unbeliever where you haven't put your trust in Jesus, this is why Jesus came. He came to fix our sin, to be the path back to this. I've read this before. John 14, 1-6, Jesus looks at his disciples, talking about the fact that he's leaving, and he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God and trust also in me. Look at this line. There's more than enough room in my Father's home. You read that after seeing that picture of the city of God, you're like, okay, that makes perfect sense now, doesn't it? He's like, we're not short on space. There's plenty. There's plenty of room for all of you. He says, when everything's ready, when that city is prepared and built, right? I'll come and get you so you'll always be with me where I am. And you know the way to where I'm going. Like I said before, I love the honesty. No, we don't, Lord. No, Lord, Thomas said. We have no idea where you're going, so how can we know the way? And Jesus tells him, I'm the way. I'm the truth and I'm the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. He says, I'm the path to that place. Friends, if you are an unbeliever, I just want to invite you and tell you there is more than enough room in our Father's house. He has a beautiful place prepared for you, and the reason why Jesus came to this earth to die was to make sure that someday you don't get left out of that beautiful eternity, that you're going to share it with him. Would you do me a favor and pray with me for a minute? God, thank you so much just for your goodness, God. God, thank you so much for the beautiful place that you've prepared for us after this. Thank you so much that some of my friends that I love so much who've already gone there, I can picture them in joy and in beauty. I pray, God, that if any of us, when we think about the idea of leaving this life and going on to heaven, if any of us have that fear or that sadness, I pray that you would grow in us an understanding of the blessing you have waiting for us. Maybe some of us right now, we would just pray and say, God, just open my eyes to recognize how beautiful eternity will be, so that I won't be distracted by this life. And God, if there's any here who right now don't know you, I just pray that in this moment you would just take their hand. That right now, even in this moment, they might just whisper in their mind, Jesus, thank you for dying in my place. Please become the king of my life. I am sorry for my sin. I trust you as my path. I want to go with you to heaven. And I pray, God, that you would rescue their heart in this moment. You would pay for all of their sin, and you would grant them access to your kingdom in eternity. Jesus, let us get a better view of heaven. In your name we pray. Amen.